Admiral Vrethor of the Calferian Armada stood atop the command dais of the Star Eater, his three eyes gleaming with the kind of smug satisfaction that only comes from centuries of unchallenged conquest. Before him, a massive holographic display rendered the Sol system in cold, clinical detail. To the rest of the galaxy, this was a graveyard of ambition, a forbidden zone populated by the mythical Deathworlders. To Vrethor, it was simply the next resource to be harvested. Around him, 200 of the Hegemony's finest military commanders waited in a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. They adjusted their breathing apparatuses and smoothed their scales, waiting for the word to begin the glassing of the third planet. Vrethor dismissed the legends of humans with a flick of his primary mandible. He had heard the stories. Predators born from a world where the gravity crushed bone, where the atmosphere was a toxic mix of nitrogen and oxygen, and where even the weather could kill you. He believed none of it. To him, humans were a convenient bedtime story told by weak species to justify their own failures. The conquest, Vrethor announced, his voice echoing through the metallic ribs of the bridge, will be a formality. We have tracked their fleets. They are nothing but cargo haulers and primitive scouts. Today, we prove that the Deathworlder is a ghost story for hatchlings. The plan had been flawless until the incident in the loading bay. His second officer, a bumbling sentry named Garvok, had returned from a black market station near the system's edge with what he called a prize of high culinary value. Garvok had boasted of purchasing a crate of Bulvation grubs, a rare delicacy, for a fraction of their market price. Vrethor had laughed, already imagining the feast that would follow the destruction of Earth. However, the atmosphere on the flagship shifted the moment the cargo was uncrated. The emergency alarm didn't just beep, it screamed. A jagged, high-frequency pitch reserved for catastrophic hull breaches or the presence of an apex pathogen. Vrethor stormed down to the loading dock to find Garvok standing paralyzed, his eye stalks drooping in profound terror. In the center of the bay lay no grub. Instead, resting on a pile of colorful synthetic fabric, was a small, pale creature. It was tiny, fragile, and seemingly helpless. Then it opened its mouth. The sound that erupted from the infant was a physical force. It was a screeching, high-decibel wail that bypassed the Calferians' auditory filters and vibrated directly in their nervous systems. It was the sound of a species that had evolved to survive by demanding the universe's attention. "Garvok!" Vrethor hissed, his mandibles clicking with a lethal rhythm. "Please tell me that is not what I think it is." "The vendor, he said it was exotic livestock, Admiral." Garvok stammered, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. "He said it was a rare delicacy from the Outer Rim." The ship's medical officer, Mira, stepped forward, her scanners trembling. "Admiral, this is not livestock. The DNA markers are unmistakable. This is a human infant, and it is in distress." Before Vrethor could issue an order to vent the bay and hide the evidence, every screen on the bridge turned a violent, piercing white. The ship's communication array had been forcibly overridden by a signal of such raw power, it threatened to melt the Star Eater's processors. The identifier burned into the HUD Terran Defense Coalition, Priority Alpha. The holographic display materialized into the face of a human woman, Commander Patricia Wells of the battlecruiser Resolve. Her skin was pale, her hair pulled back with military severity, but it was her eyes that froze Vrethor's blood. They were cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of fear. She was wearing the expression humans wore when they were being very polite right before they began the killing. "Admiral Vrethor," Wells said, her voice a calm, low-frequency promise of future violence. "We have reason to believe you have accidentally acquired human property, specifically a citizen who has not yet reached the age of majority." She didn't offer a diplomat. She didn't ask for a ceasefire. "You have exactly 12 standard hours to reach the designated waypoint. The child must be unharmed, well-fed, and calm. If you fail, I will personally ensure that your flagship becomes a case study in creative disassembly. Do not test our patience. We are already having a very long day." The transmission cut to black, leaving the bridge in a stunned, terrified silence. Far away, in the conference hall of Eternal Accord, the atmosphere was vastly different. The great houses of the galaxy were bickering over trade tariffs and mining rights, blissfully unaware that the fuse of a galactic powder keg had been lit. In the very back row, the place reserved for the unimportant species, the human representative Marcus Webb sat perfectly still. A silent ping echoed from his datapad. Webb didn't stand, he didn't shout. He slowly closed his eyes, took a long, measured breath through his nose, and whispered into his localized comms, "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." At that exact second, 20,000 light-years away, at the edge of the Sol system's helipause, the galaxy's perception of reality shattered. The space debris the Calferian fleet had ignored for a week, the frozen rocks and dead husks of old satellites, suddenly began to glow. The humans hadn't been hiding. They had been running cold, their heat signatures masked by the absolute zero of the void. Now, 4,000 human combat vessels decloaked simultaneously. Their thrusters ignited like a new constellation of predatory red stars, and the Resolve led the charge, moving toward the Hegemony's doorstep with the singular purpose of a scalpel. The back row was no longer watching. The back row was moving. And Vrethor realized with a sinking horror in all three of his hearts that the baby in his loading bay wasn't a victim. It was a beacon. The Calferian Armada did not simply retreat. They fled the Sol system in a panicked emergency jump that pushed their warp cores to the brink of meltdown. Admiral Vrethor, normally a pillar of cold composure, sat slumped in his command chair, his secondary hearts hammering against his ribs. The image of those 4,000 human ghosts, ships that shouldn't have been there, ships that had ignored every rule of stealth physics, was burned into his retinas. He returned to the conference hall of Eternal Accord expecting to find a galaxy mobilized for a glorious war of attrition. He expected fleets to be discussed, plasma yields to be measured, and territorial lines to be drawn in the sand. Instead, he found a middle-aged man in a charcoal gray suit sitting at the massive obsidian table, calmly sipping from a ceramic mug that smelled faintly of roasted beans. This was Daniel Foster. He didn't wear a uniform, he didn't carry a sidearm. His only equipment was a sleek silver data tablet and a look of genuine, mild amusement that made the assembled alien warlords look like children playing with sticks. "Where is the Terran High Command?" Commander Thraxus of the Calden Starfleet roared, his 9 feet of scaled fury towering over the human. "We are discussing the movement of 300 warships, and Earth sends..." "You." Foster looked up, adjusted his glasses, and smiled. It was a pleasant, disarming expression that did nothing to hide the predatory intelligence behind his eyes. "The military is currently engaged in a very important mid-season chess tournament, Commander. I'm an economist, and on weekends I do some light consulting for agricultural development on our Mars colonies. I assure you, for what we are about to do, I am more than overqualified." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of chittering, whistling, and electromagnetic static. It was an insult. It was a joke. But Foster didn't flinch. He simply tapped his tablet, and the massive central holoprojector, usually reserved for star maps and fleet formations, flickered to life. It didn't show ships, it showed numbers. "Let's talk about your supply chain, Admiral Vrethor," Foster said, his voice cutting through the noise like a cold blade. "You have 17 core worlds. 84% of your heavy metals come from the Beltaza belt. Your fleet's primary propellant is refined in the gaseous rings of Ura Prime. You have a very impressive military, but your logistics are, how shall I put this, adorable." Foster began to scroll through the data, and Vrethor's blood turned to ice. With a series of rapid-fire projections, Foster demonstrated what human intelligence called tactical prescience. It wasn't just predicting a move, it was removing the ground the opponent needed to stand on before they even realized they were walking. Humanity hadn't fired a single shot since the child was taken. Instead, they had used their logistics experts, men and women like Foster who treated war as a variable in a larger equation. They had already begun rerouting the automated asteroid tugs in the Beltaza belt using subtle software glitches. They had restructured the trade routes of the Hegemony's largest food producers through clerical errors in the Galactic Stock Exchange. "We don't do half measures," Foster said, his smile finally fading. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the delegates. "A warrior tries to kill you. An accountant removes your reason to exist. In exactly 17 hours, your industrial centers will run out of the rare earth minerals required to maintain your life support systems. You aren't losing because you're weak, Vrethor. You're losing because you're no longer profitable." Just as the Council began to digest the terrifying reality that they were being unmade by spreadsheets, a frantic red-coded alert flashed across Vrethor's personal HUD. It was a high-priority distress signal from the Hegemony's primary shipyard, the forge where their invincible dreadnoughts were born. The message was incoherent with terror. A human logistics team hadn't just rerouted trade. They had somehow gained remote access to the core reactors of the shipyard's defensive grid through a back door in the maintenance software. The human agricultural equipment orbiting the station, massive lumbering harvesters intended for ice mining, was suddenly broadcasting weapon-lock signatures that matched a Terran dreadnought. The harvesters weren't there to mine ice. They were positioned at the shipyard's structural weak points, their heavy-duty industrial lasers recalibrated for surgical demolition. "As I said," Foster whispered, leaning back and taking another sip of his coffee, "tactical prescience. You can't fight a war if you can't afford the fuel. And right now, Admiral, your credit score is 0. The Hegemony High Council did not take Daniel Foster's economic warnings as a surrender. They took them as a challenge. To the Calferian mind, if you could not win with steel, you were not worthy of the stars. Admiral Vrethor, a veteran of 100 planetary sieges, authorized the mobilization of the Unbreakable Vanguard. 300 warships representing the absolute pinnacle of 17 star systems' military might. These weren't just ships. They were icons of imperial dominance, plated in collapse-resistant alloys and armed with disruptor cannons that could boil an ocean in minutes. Aboard the human flagship Relentless, Admiral Marcus Webb viewed the incoming Hegemony fleet on his tactical display. He didn't order the activation of the primary battery. He didn't even put down his Galaxy's Best Admiral mug. Instead, he checked the date on his console and let out a soft, appreciative hum. "It's October 12th, Webb noted to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Okafor. "The timing is actually quite impeccable. We were struggling to find a diverse enough OP4 for the Academy's midterm evaluations." "Sir?" Okafor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Notify the fleet." "This is no longer a standard patrol," Webb said, his voice carrying a mischievous edge. "Transition all non-essential systems to educational broadcast mode. We're going to treat this as a generously volunteered training opposition. Let the cadets have their fun." Admiral Vrethor's sensory stalks went rigid with pure, unadulterated outrage when his flagship's comms array began to receive a human transmission. It wasn't on a military encryption. It was on an open, unshielded educational frequency typically used for basic flight school manuals. The message was a polite, automated voice. "Welcome, valued training partner. Please proceed to grid reference 7 Alpha for your scheduled assessment. Your performance will be recorded for educational purposes." Vrethor launched his elite Void Stalker interceptors, expecting a swift and bloody massacre of the human trainees. Instead, they were met by human ships that looked wrong. These weren't the gray, jagged killers they had seen at the helipause. These vessels were marked with bright, obnoxious orange training stripes. The engagement that followed was less of a space battle and more of a televised public lecture. As the Hegemony's finest pilots performed high-G maneuvers and complex firing patterns, human instructors began broadcasting live feedback on open channels. "Look at Alpha 1's thrust vectoring," a human voice praised over the comms, audible to every Hegemony pilot. "That's textbook. Very smooth, very butter. Cadets, take note of how he leaves his rear quarter exposed during the turn. That's a 3-point deduction in a live fire exercise." Vrethor watched in a state of catatonic shock as his unbreakable cruisers were systematically incapacitated. The humans weren't missing. They were aiming with such terrifying precision that they were disabling engines and neutralizing weapon mounts while pointedly leaving life support and crew quarters intact. Every time a Calferian pilot thought they had a lock, a human cadet, some of whom sounded barely old enough to have finished their species' secondary education, would execute a counter-tactic that left the Hegemony ship spinning helplessly in the dark. The final humiliation came when a live leaderboard appeared on Vrethor's main view screen. The Hegemony's Unbreakable Vanguard was currently ranked 14th out of 14 participants, placing them firmly behind 3 student squadrons and a group of enthusiasts from something called the Junior Space Camp. "Admiral Vrethor," Webb's voice crackled over the link, sounding genuinely pleased. "Your people make excellent training partners. Your quantum torpedoes are truly impressive. We'd love to study the telemetry. We're offering a draw. Go home, fix your ships, and maybe we can do this again next year." Webb's voice then dropped an octave, the warmth vanishing. "But I must warn you, my cadets are graded on their restraint. If any of them are actually harmed, I'll be forced to bring in the varsity team. And believe me, Admiral, they don't care about your grades. They only care about the mathematics of total erasure." The Hegemony High Council, blinded by their bruised egos, chose to ignore the warning. They didn't see a species that was holding back. They saw a species that was playing games because it was too cowardly to kill. To break the human games, once and for all, the Council authorized a devastating, unauthorized strike against a defenseless civilian colony on New Perth. They intended to force the varsity team into the light. They had no idea that by targeting the innocent, they weren't just starting a war. They were breaking the final seals on a primordial nightmare that humanity had spent 10,000 years trying to forget. The Conference Hall of Eternal Accord was built to withstand the sonic booms of atmosphere entry ships and the psychic screams of dying stars, yet it had never been as silent as it was the moment Ambassador Vrethor uploaded the New Perth casualty report. The numbers didn't just appear. They scrolled across every delegate's neural interface with a clinical, unfeeling rhythm. 3 billion human lives, extinguished in the time it took to draw a single breath. Vrethor's feeding tentacles curled with a dark, oily satisfaction as he looked down from the high podium. "As you can see, honored delegates," he announced, his voice echoing with a wet, grating gurgle, "the Terran problem is solving itself. Our varsity team strike was a necessary surgical correction. Another 2 cycles, perhaps 3, and their industrial centers will collapse entirely. Then we simply mop up the stragglers." A ripple of profound unease moved through the chamber. High Arbiter Thexon, a mantis-like creature whose species had seen empires rise and fall for 10 millennia, clicked his mandibles in a slow, rhythmic warning. "Ambassador Vrethor," Thexon whispered. "Our projections indicated total surrender after the first 100 million casualties. We are now at 30 times that figure. Have you considered that you are not breaking their will, but rather removing the only thing that kept them in check?" Vrethor laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "They are primitive. They are ignorant. They are too stupid to know when they are beaten." In the very back row, Marcus Webb sat like a statue carved from cold Atlantic stone. He didn't look like a representative of a dying world. He looked like an apex predator that had finished a complex calculation and arrived at a singular, inevitable answer. For 73 cycles, humanity had played the part of the Galactic helper. They had hauled toxic waste through zones no other species would touch. They had smiled through insults and offered humanitarian aid to the very empires that spat on their borders. But as the final tally of the dead flickered out, the annoyance protocol officially expired. The galaxy had ignored the warnings, the tight smiles, the measured breaths, the quiet requests for mutual understanding. "Has anyone actually studied what the humans were doing before we attacked?" Commander Yizig of the Calferian Observers asked, her chromatophores flickering a terrified, bruised purple. She pulled up a sensor feed that made the entire assembly gasp. 3 weeks ago, every single human military installation went dark. Not a single transmission. Not a single scout ship. They didn't go dark to hide. They went dark to listen. Marcus Webb stood up. He didn't wait for the floor to be yielded. He didn't use a microphone. He simply spoke, and his voice was a jagged blade that cut through the vacuum of the hall. "You made a critical mistake," Webb said, and for the first time, his eyes met Vrethor's. There was no hatred in them, only a deep, ancient disappointment. "You assumed that because we chose to be peaceful, we had forgotten how to be terrifying. You saw our table manners and forgot we are predators. You bombed New Perth because you wanted to see our varsity team." "Well, Ambassador, the varsity team is just the warm-up." Webb tapped a single command into his datapad. "We didn't build bunkers beneath our poles to hide our people from your bombs. We built them as wardens. We were the only thing keeping the original owners of our planet in the dark. But now we have a debt to pay. And 3 billion lives is a lot of currency." Just as Vrethor began to sputter a retort, every alarm in the council chamber erupted in a discordant harmony of terror. The main view screen flickered to life, showing a live feed of Earth's Arctic Circle. The ice wasn't melting, it was shattering. Massive plates of frost thousands of feet thick were being pushed aside from below. Something massive was rising. Something with scales that didn't reflect light but seemed to eat it. Wings the size of continental shelves unfurled, casting a shadow that blotted out the sun. A roar, raw and primordial, bypassed the ship's sensors and vibrated in the very bones of every delegate in the hall. "The cages are open," Webb whispered into the silence. "And they are very, very hungry." On screen, the first dragon took flight, not toward the human cities, but straight up, toward the Hegemony's blockade. The hunt had begun. The bridge of the Hegemony's flagship, the Imperial Talon, had become a symphony of chaotic, high-pitched malfunctions. The sensor operator's voice, normally a rhythmic drone of status reports, cracked with an absolute primitive panic that no military training could suppress. "Admiral, multiple massive energy signatures detected. They aren't ships, they're emerging from the planet's mantle." Through the massive reinforced view screen, the Council watched in frozen horror as the Arctic ice cap of Earth didn't just crack, it pulverized. A wound opened in the world, kilometers wide, spewing steam and ancient gases. Out of the white abyss rose a creature of such impossible scale that the mind struggled to categorize it. It was nearly 2 kilometers in length, a serpent-like behemoth with iridescent scales that shimmered with a sheen that seemed to absorb and refract light in ways that defied known optics. Its wings, unfurling like the sails of a nightmare, were the size of continental shelves, casting a shadow over the retreating fleet that felt like a death sentence. From its throat came a roar that bypassed the vacuum of space, transmitted through the very fabric of reality. It wasn't a sound. It was a biological sonar that struck the delegates with a primal genetic fear, vibrating in their bones and making their secondary hearts skip beats. The creature, which the humans had simply labeled the Firstborn in their classified files, focused its gaze on a Hegemony dreadnought. With a fluid, terrifying grace, it opened its mouth. There was no charging of capacitors, no hum of energy. Instead, a beam of plasma contained within a biological magnetic field erupted, superheated to temperatures that made the cores of blue giant stars seem cool. The beam struck the most advanced multi-layered shields in the Hegemony's arsenal. They held for less than a half-second before collapsing into static. The dreadnought did not explode. It was converted into constituent atoms, scattered across the void like glowing dust in a hurricane. Director Marcus Webb's voice crackled over the emergency channels, but it sounded different now. It was no longer the voice of a tired diplomat. It was the voice of a warden who had finally decided the prisoners were no longer worth the trouble of guarding. "Admiral Vrethor," Webb said, his words echoing through the bridge of every surviving ship. "You assumed we were building bunkers to hide our civilians. You assumed we were cowering behind the ice because we were afraid of your fire. You were wrong. Those facilities were not bunkers. They were the lock on a cage. We didn't keep these things underground to protect us. We kept them there to protect you from the things that owned our planet before we learned to walk upright." As he spoke, a second, sleeker entity emerged from the southern pole. The Void Dragon did not use fire. It expelled a wave of negative light, a dark energy that the vacuum of space itself seemed to fear. As the wave passed through the Hegemony's wing of destroyers, the ships didn't burn. They simply stopped. All reactors went cold. All life support ceased, and the hulls turned into floating coffins of rime and silence. Webb explained the terrible bargain of humanity's prehistory. Humanity had spent millennia keeping these nightmares locked away, fearing the price of their freedom. These were the biological titans forged in the furnace of a death world. Creatures that didn't just survive on Earth, but dominated it before the first human sharpened a stick. And now, Webb continued, the main event. From beneath the continental fault lines rose the Titans. These were humanoid entities 300 meters tall, built of living metal that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns of deep violet and gold. They possessed fusion reactions occurring within their very cell structures, making them walking supernova-level threats. One Titan reached out with a slow, deliberate movement and closed its metallic fist around a Rexian cruiser. The hull, designed to withstand orbital bombardment, crumpled like wet tissue paper. The message was final. The Hegemony's atrocity had proven that human compassion was viewed only as a weakness to be exploited. Humanity had officially stopped pretending to be a member of a peaceful community. They had returned to their roots as the survivors of a world that breeds monsters. As the entities began to move in a coordinated predatory formation toward the remaining Council fleet, the Pacific Ocean began to churn with a violence that could be felt from orbit. A new, much larger signature was appearing. One so massive it possessed its own localized gravitational field and existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Reality itself began to recoil from its presence, the stars around the Sol system flickering and distorting. The Admiral realized with a soul-crushing certainty that the Dragons and the Titans were only the scouts. The Wardens had opened the door, and the thing that lived in the deepest dark was finally coming out to play. The Pacific Ocean did not just churn, it seemed to fold in on itself. The water-defying gravity as the final seal of the Terran Defense Initiative, Protocol 0, was shattered. What emerged from the depths made the dragons and titans look like simple creatures of flesh and bone. This was a horror of geometry and light, an entity that existed in layers. It was a nightmare of tentacles that didn't just move through the water, but through the very fabric of the three-dimensional plane, splitting into molecular chains that vibrated at frequencies the human ear could only perceive as a low, bone-deep thrum of dread. Admiral Vrethor watched the main view screen of the Star Eater, his three eyes twitching in a rhythmic, localized seizure as his ship's sensors simply gave up. The logic circuits designed to categorize matter and energy began throwing probability error and existence not found codes. The Pacific entity didn't attack the fleet with lasers or kinetic rounds. It looked at them, and the fleet began to unmake. It was not destruction in any conventional military sense. It was a conceptual rejection. Ships did not explode in gouts of flame. They simply became less real with each passing millisecond. Vrethor watched a neighboring destroyer begin to flicker like a dying light bulb. One moment it was a solid mass of alloy and 10,000 soldiers. The next it was a translucent ghost, its atoms forgetting how to bond, its energy ceasing to flow as reality itself recoiled from a presence so fundamentally alien that the universe chose to delete the affected area rather than coexist with it. Earth is 4.5 billion years old, Admiral. Director Webb's voice echoed through the bridge, ignoring the screams of the crew. His voice was no longer coming through the comms. It was vibrating directly inside the Admiral's mind. Do you really think humans were the first intelligent species to evolve on our world? Or the second? Or even the 10th? Webb spoke of a history buried under kilometers of sediment and forgotten by time. Of a planet where gods once walked as living flesh and nightmares bred in the deep, pressurized trenches where reality was negotiable. Humans had not climbed to the top of the food chain through mere tool use. They had survived by being the only species pragmatic enough to make arrangements with the ancient things that lived in the dark. We became the monsters that other monsters were willing to talk to, Webb stated, the weight of 3 billion human souls coloring his words with a dark, necrotic edge. He informed the trembling council that they had not just started a war, they had broken the peace treaty between the surface and the deep. The Hegemony's bombs had proven that human compassion was no longer a viable shield. They were bored, Vrethor, Webb whispered. They've been trapped in the dark for eons, waiting for a reason to see the stars again. You gave them that reason. You showed them that the galaxy is full of soft, arrogant things that don't know how to scream in the right frequency. Vrethor realized the true scale of the disaster as he watched his fleet being unproven from the timeline. This was not a defense of a planet. It was the funeral of an empire. The monsters of Earth were moving with a singular, coordinated purpose, their movements synchronized across light years as if the Sol system were merely a single room in a much larger house. What did you promise them? Vrethor croaked, his voice a dry rasp as his own hands began to turn translucent. A fair trade, Webb concluded, his face appearing one last time on the dying monitors. We promised them the galaxy. We promised them 17 core worlds and every living soul within the Hegemony. We gave them your names, your coordinates, and your history. As the first reports came in from the Hegemony's homeworlds, reporting massive multi-dimensional energy signatures appearing in their own oceans and skies, the Admiral realized the nightmare had gone interstellar. The Red List had been handed over to entities that didn't understand the concept of mercy, only the hunger of the void. The total war ended not with a climactic explosion, but with a silence so absolute it felt heavy. As the last of Earth's ancient wardens slipped back into the shadows of the deep oceans and the frozen poles, the Hegemony's military machine didn't just stop. It disintegrated. Admiral Court, the highest-ranking officer left in a fleet that now consisted of translucent ghosts and derelict hulls, issued a universal surrender on all frequencies. He didn't ask for terms. He simply commanded his remaining forces to power down their reactors and wait. He had seen a planet's mythology rise and swallow a fleet. He knew that any further resistance was merely a complicated form of suicide, but as the galaxy held its breath, expecting a counter-invasion or a planetary glassing, humanity did something far more terrifying. They became clinical. Director Marcus Webb appeared one final time in the council chambers, but he was no longer alone. Standing behind him was a man the Galactic intelligence agencies had only whispered about in reports marked Level 0, Marcus Kane. Kane did not wear a suit or a uniform. He wore a tactical weave that seemed to pull light into a singularity, and his eyes had the flat, dead look of a professional who had already seen the end of the world and survived it. Phase 1. Neutralization is complete, Webb announced to the trembling delegates. Phase 2. Accountability begins now. Kane stepped forward and tapped a command on a wrist-mounted console. Simultaneously, every screen in the council hall and every personal comlink of every high-ranking official in the Hegemony flared red. A list began to scroll. It was the Red List, an exhaustive, color-coded database of 3,000 names. It included every politician who had signed the New Perth execution order, every tactician who had mapped the civilian targets, and every officer who had cheered as the bombs fell. You assumed our shadow organizations were focused on your technology. Kane's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like grinding stones. You were wrong. We've been embedded in your system since the day you first made contact with our outer colonies. We know your private bank accounts. We know your mistresses. We know the exact frequency of your children's sleep cycles. The horror in the room was palpable. It was one thing to be outgunned by space dragons. It was another to realize that for 50 years your entire civilization had been a glass house, and the humans had been living in your basement. Within the next hour, Kane continued, those on this list will find a pine box waiting at their primary residence. It is a carbon fiber transport case, 6 feet in length, marked with the Terran seal. You have 2 choices. You can step into the box and surrender for trial at the New Perth War Crimes Tribunal. Or you can refuse. And if we refuse? A senator from the Hegemony's inner circle stammered, his tentacles trembling. Kane leaned in, his face filling the massive holographic projectors. If you refuse, you will be relocated by Homeworld Security. We don't use dragons for that. We use people like me. And I promise you, the dragons are much more merciful than we are. The Red List trials became the most efficient purge in galactic history. There was no corner of the Hegemony deep enough to hide from a species that had turned the entire galactic network into a tracking device. Human agents, silent, invisible, and utterly relentless, appeared in high-security bunkers and luxury penthouses alike. They didn't fire shots. They simply pointed to the boxes. By the end of the week, the entire upper echelon of the Hegemony's war cabinet was sitting in a high-security facility in Montana, awaiting a human judge. Humanity had proven that their reach was not just long, but surgical. They had dismantled an empire's leadership without scratching a single civilian or firing a single planetary-scale weapon. As the first trials began, broadcast to every star system in the galaxy, Marcus Webb sat in the back row of the Montana courtroom, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked at the monsters in the dock, the ones who had murdered 3 billion people, and he didn't feel anger. He only felt the cold, hard weight of a debt being settled, cent by cent, name by name. The dust of Hegemony's collapse did not settle into a graveyard, but into a classroom. The trials of the Red List had concluded with the kind of clinical, terrifying precision that only humans could manage, proving that their justice was as thorough as their warfare. Every empire that had once sought to extinguish the light of Sol found itself not enslaved, but integrated. Using the tactical prescience Daniel Foster had pioneered, humanity didn't occupy worlds. They wove them into a complex web of economic and agricultural interdependence that made future conflict a mathematical impossibility. To attack Earth now would be to delete one's own food supply and life support. Chancellor Morix oversaw the formal reopening of the council hall, but the very geography of power had shifted forever. The prestigious front-row seats, once the domain of the arrogant and the posturing, now sat echoing and empty. Instead, the highest tiers of the amphitheater, the back row, were the most sought-after positions in the chamber. Species that once measured strength by proximity to the speaker now measured it by the breadth of their perspective. They had learned the human secret. Real power isn't about being heard, it's about what you can see before anyone else knows it's there. Ambassador Marcus Webb remained in Tier 297, Seat 40. He refused every offer to move to the center platform, preferring his humble vantage point. To him, the back row was not a sign of submission, but a practical sanctuary. He sat casually, often with a ceramic cup of coffee that became a symbol of Terran stability, watching the galaxy adopt the annoyance protocol as its primary diplomatic doctrine. The lesson was now universal and legally binding across 4 galactic quadrants. If a human says they are getting annoyed, you fix the problem immediately. You don't ask why, you don't negotiate, you simply move. One evening, after a routine session on trade logistics, Vrix, the protocol officer, found Webb looking out at the stars from the observation deck. Vrix had seen the humans move from being treated as galactic janitors to becoming the architects of a new, quiet order. He approached Webb, his primary sensory stalks twitching, with a question that had burned in the Council's mind for cycles. "Director," Vrix began softly, "the galaxy is still uneasy. They see the dragons have returned to the ice. They see the Pacific entity has faded back into the depths. But we saw the footage of your people after the victory. Your leaders, they weren't celebrating. They were weeping for the 3 billion you lost." Webb didn't turn around. He watched a human freighter dock with the station, its movements precise and graceful. "We don't celebrate victories that cost us our humanity, Vrix. Every time we open those cages, we lose a little bit of the civilization we spent 10,000 years building. We aren't nice because we are weak. We are nice because we are terrified of what we become when we stop being nice." He turned then, a tired, sad smile playing on his lips. "We are apex predators with table manners. We work so hard at being peaceful because we know exactly what happens when the table gets flipped. We've fought ourselves to the brink of extinction more times than your council has had sessions. We chose the back row because it's the only place where we can keep an eye on everyone, including ourselves. The entities of Earth, the dragons, the titans, and the horrors of the deep, remained in their cages, but their presence was now a permanent fixture in the collective memory of the galaxy. They were the consequence of hubris, the monsters that humanity kept as a last resort. The galaxy finally understood that human kindness was a deliberate, difficult choice made every single day by a species that knew exactly how to unmake reality. As Vrix watched the human delegation depart, he realized that the galaxy's comfortable assumptions had been replaced by a sharper, safer reality. The age of the warrior culture was dead, replaced by the age of the accountants with warships. The final rule was now etched into the hearts of every starfaring race. Never, ever judge a species by how they act in peacetime, because the being that offers you a cup of coffee today is the same one that will unmake your world tomorrow if you threaten their family. And from the back row, they are always, always watching.